Hello everyone. I'm Yelena, and yes, right now I'm at ISI Foundation, and so I've been working in tracking lifestyle diseases for quite a while now, and that's what I'll be talking about today. As a great case study of what you could do with social media and the images you can find there to basically do epidemiology, right? And in that case, it will be kind of how to integrate whatever output you might find from these algorithms and libraries and services that we've talked about so far into an actual, computational social science project. But actually, my interests span beyond this. So for example, now I'm working on misinformation detection on social media, especially in health domain, in political controversies, and just general methodological questions, what is truth? So if you have any interest in those, also come, let's have a chat. So today, I would like to take a case study of lifestyle health. And why is it an interesting topic? Well, first of all, of course, it's very urgent. People are dying of diseases related to a lifestyle, like heart disease and diabetes, way more than of infectious diseases or things that you would actually see on the news, right? So the news is actually not giving us the proper view of how difficult this problem is. And obesity and diabetes is actually a big problem, and it's just getting worse in developed countries, developing countries. Everybody is just getting heavier, and it affects people's lives. So what can we do to understand better why this is happening? And it's a very complicated issue, really. And one of the things that people have been doing over many years now are things like daily diaries, right? What you did, what you ate, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really burdensome. People really don't do this, and it's really hard to get people to do this in everyday life. Yet comes social media, and here we are all posting about our breakfasts, lunches, dinners. We annotate them, there's location information about how we interact with each other. And of course, there are all these images and media. So using these, perhaps we can start to understand what people do in their daily lives. And for example, this is my own visit to Sicily and Italy, and I was quite happy, right? So there is a lot of annotation to this image that you can get just out of this one post. Now, why is it interesting to look at this data set? Well, as I said, it is self-motivated. Somehow people are already interested in revealing this information about themselves, about their daily lives. And in that sense, it's getting more and more plentiful. Some of the data sets I'll be talking about are millions and millions of, tens of millions of images. What is also nice is that it's real time. If there's some event happening right now, you can capture it pretty much immediately. Often case it is geolocated because we all have cell phones, right? They are tracking us, unless you're turning everything off, but then maybe they're tracking us anyway. But in any case, people do expose their locations quite often through posting about their daily lives, where they are precisely. It is media rich, everybody has a camera these days, and it is social being social media, right? You are in some context, people will interact with your content, and you will interact with others. And for sure it has some kind of narrative that is cultural, right? You're not only talking about yourself personally, but your understanding of the world, what is good, what is bad, what you want to share with people. And of course, it's interactive, not only in the way that we collect data, but we can then try to speak to people back, right, through these media. We could design interventions and help people maybe live a happier, more fulfilling, healthier lifestyles or whatnot. And of course, all of these things have a dark side to them. Or you can think of it as an opportunity for research. Every problem is an opportunity for research. So for example, of course, people are self-motivated to post these images, but they're not posting about everything that they do every day, right? There's some selection as to what is happening, self-projection, if you will. However, this also signifies what people really want to show, right? What are people's values somehow. Of course, it's very noisy and bursty, so often it doesn't come in as a nice, neat stream, but some one thing happens, a nice weekend, and everybody goes outside and starts posting. It's also geo-biased. You know, there are some places that people just don't post about, and yet we might be able to not find so many pictures or posts there. And of course, media is a complicated signal, and in this summer school, we're talking about how to maybe chew on it and digest it into something cohesive that we can work with. Another thing that social interactions give us is, well, we often want to say, well, isn't there social influence that we can get out of these interactions? Often, you cannot find that, right? You will find correlations, homophily, all kinds of good things. But to really find influence, you would have to make careful experiments in the best case, right? But still, the research that focuses on really understanding whether something is homophily or influence is really interesting. And finally, everything that happens on internet is contextual, right? There was this picture of my food, but it's not clear whether I was there for business or pleasure, who was around. Maybe it was a festival and everybody was posting pictures on there. So what exactly was happening around is not always clear, right? Despite people's annotations. So that is interesting to understand. And of course, finally, when we're talking about trying to communicate with people through these channels, you have to be super careful because, for example, does anybody remember when Facebook tried flagging questionable news stories? Oh, only a couple of people. Well, the moral of the story was that people would promote them more. Right, so some of these interactions, or when we're trying to persuade people to behave a certain way, they might backfire and you have to be super careful. And plus, all of the asterisks, all of the biases of social media about self-selection, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many cool things about it and many things you have to keep your mind on. So what I will tell you a little bit about is latest efforts in tracking lifestyle diseases and some other things as well through social media. So first, I will tell you a little bit about what has been done and show you some example code of the pipeline that some research like that might use. So let me talk about my favorite study, like one of my first ones that began this whole thing, is tracking obesity through social media. So if you've never worked with social media, this could be useful because often case you don't want to look at the whole thing, right? All of Facebook, all of Twitter is too much. You are interested in something in particular. So you say, okay, I have this thing. I have some lexicon of things that I want to track. And in this case, it's food. You might get it from previous research or even make it yourself. There's no shame in that. In fact, it might be exactly what you're looking for. Then you go to your API or scraper and get some data and somehow figure out, well, what are parts of this data that we want to actually analyze. And here we're interested in users that we can geolocate to a particular place. Then we can get histories of these users, of what they said before, and through these histories we can actually enrich our lexicon and see what else have they been talking about. This could then feed actually into this loop, and we can refine our data set, both the data set and the lexicon, and produce finally a nice both data set about foods on Twitter, about from people that we can geolocate, and our nice lexicon. Okay, so you can imagine, and I will later show you, this data is big. So it may be millions of records, thousands of people, well, and text and images and all of these. So often what we want to do is not look at it in aggregate, but have a specific quantification task and say, well, what am I actually trying to understand from this? And here we say, okay, what we want to really know is how heavy or unhealthy the food is that people are eating. So we can say that, well, we want to just estimate what calories people are consuming, which is like just one number. So we don't care about like, oh, you had a pizza, so let's count like the slices of sausage on it. We will just squint and say, well, we just give it this aggregate value. And then we just have these mean descriptors of common foods that we will apply to our data set. Then, of course, what is important is geolocation of our users. Why? Who could tell me why without me clicking next?
Pizza in Chicago is maybe
Exactly, this pizza in Chicago is totally different than anywhere. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe different people in different places have different eating habits or something like that.
That's true. And we can relate people to aggregate statistics in their place, right? Just like we could say, Chicago people are, on average maybe healthier than people from Colorado, which is probably not true. But basically, of course, it's difficult to say that one particular individual has some kind of health status. And in fact, Twitter terms of service forbid you to do so. You gotta read that, it's really fun reading. But basically, if you look at aggregate people, you can say, okay, these, some hopefully thousands of people that we found are in this state or this county. And then we can say, well, this is a high obesity, low obesity, high smoking, low smoking, etc. So for example, if we look at geolocation of the tweets, is often very little. And in fact, they're phasing it out altogether. Often what we want to do is look at where people self-declare to live. It's often bogus, so it's not even a location. But basically, you would use some kind of gazetteer, some library to look up people's locations. If you're really desperate, you can see what locations are mentioned in the data itself. But that's even worse because you don't know that people are actually there. So for example, here we used Yahoo Placemaker API, but there are many other APIs that will ingest text and give you actual location ID, other things. But in fact, I'm not sure it works anymore. So Yahoo has been phasing out its services. So I'll show you another one later. So we have on one side aggregate statistics about people's health. On the other side, the caloric values that people have tweeted about. So now we can kind of relate one to another. So this is the average caloric value of the tweet, and this is the obesity percentage in that state. So people who live in the states may recognize right away that there's this south bunch of purple states that are notorious for having bad healthcare outcomes. And we can see that they both have high obesity rates and tweet about heavy foods. Yet we have, Vermont, Wyoming, DC, places where you basically can go skiing or riding horses in the wild. They are both low obesity and low caloric value of tweets. And it is quite interesting that this works so well because this is an extremely simple model, right? The idea is that we were interested in this one abstraction of what people do, which is caloric value, and it actually works very well. We have some nice correlations here with diabetes as well. And we actually built a model based on just the keywords that we would find, and it didn't work as well. So really interpreting it as foods as calories instead of foods themselves worked better, right? And in the end, we actually build the final model by also introducing demographics if we can find them about people, because if you're doing social science, demographics always have to be there. Right? It's your strongest baseline. Okay, so this was pretty cool, but really, like, we condensed thousands of people into like these few spots, right? We can do more than this. So we can come back to the census and say, well, what is your education and income? We can look at people's usernames and say, what gender are they? It's not as easy as you think, but it's possible. And then we can do statistics like, well, as education level increases, the caloric value of what you tweet decreases. But it doesn't work with income. So it seems to be some kind of like cultural thing over there. So it's this stuff, fun stuff like that. So I've mentioned actually previously here that we used Crowdflower for annotating of the names. And so far we haven't really talked about this. So I just want to mention something about crowdsourcing as a way to process your data. Because yeah, we have all these fancy models now, you know, and they're very fun to play with, but there's nothing like asking people. So who knows what this picture represents? What is this? Yeah.
Like it's one picture or two pictures?
That's two pictures, yeah. It's a mechanical Turk, and so basically the idea is that you pretend that it's a machine, but it's really a person inside a machine, right? It's a machine playing chess. Turing machine has to speak, but the machine with intelligence. But in any case, this intelligence is fake, right? It's a human intelligence. So the idea is that instead of trying to apply fancy math to your data, and especially when it's very subjective, you might want to ask a bunch of people. So who here has not tried crowdsourcing? Okay, then I'm not talking to like people who are already expert in it. So the idea is that you have a simple task. You have a bunch of images, say, and you want to know whether they have, say, something very subjective. Whether somebody's flirting with somebody else, right? And this is perhaps a difficult task for a computer, and you want really high quality information. So what you do is you break it down in the most simple task. You say, here's an image. Is this person flirting with another? Yes, no. Like very simple, very, yeah. And so you break it down, and often there are all kinds of websites that will help you do this. Often it's cheap per label. Often you want to do some quality checks, you know, so that it's not like bots that are just taking your money. You do it, you have several people label the same thing so that you're sure of what is coming out. And basically, what it gives you not only a data set that has been annotated by real people, it also might give you your upper bound of how well a person can do on a task at all, right? If it's a difficult task, maybe some people just don't know when they're being flirted with, and you've met these people, right? And this might give you an upper bound of how well you can hope to perform on a certain task. Maybe your wonderful computational models are giving you sad accuracy, and you're feeling bad about it. But if you actually ask real people to do the same task, you might find out that it's just a hard task, right? So in that sense, crowdsourcing can help you very much. Okay, so let's go back to our project. So we have all of this data on people's posting of various foods, and we can, for example, separate them into living in urban areas in the cities versus rural ones, and see which foods are more mentioned in one than the other. And we can see clearly a separation of the things that people mention, with people in the cities liking to drink a lot, and comfort foods in the rural area. So this is US, so maybe in other countries it would be different. Or we can go down to the individual and ask, are these people how are their individual behaviors impacting perhaps their health. So for example, some people actually self-reference and say, oh, I have fat girl problems, fat boy problems. Right? We don't know whether they are actually heavy or not, but it's a self-declaration of some sort, and then you can map it somehow to where they live and say, okay, people who mention these keywords are also in high, in areas with higher levels of obesity, or other high precision keywords, etc. Or the way that we can understand what people are into, we can basically look at who they follow or what they read, right? And so, for example, in Twitter, we can say, aha, you're following, I don't know, CNN and BBC, so you're into world news, and then we can actually extend our understanding of individuals through these means, and then again, correlate them with different factors around them. Oh yeah, we found that being interested in European football was better for your health, or associated with better health than the American one. But of course, there's no, again, the causality is hard to say, just because from all of a sudden I start watching football doesn't mean my obesity, problems can be solved. But still, the observation stands. Another thing we can look at are networks. So it is a social media, right? And there are some social relationships that we can determine between people. And for example, we can build from Facebook friendship or mention network. So, friendship. So if you are following each other, then there's a link. Or if you're mentioning each other, there's a link. And so what we want to see is whether a user is activated. Now this activation is basically this user looking like they might have a health problem. So actually you're not like being active, but this is a bad thing if you're active. So we're using a threshold model which basically says, well, what is probability of a node given some neighborhood around this node, if some of these neighbors have some kind of property, that this node also gets this property. So we want to know what is the activation probability of you, given that some of your neighbors are activated users. And then basically you look at, well, maybe one of your friends were activated. What is your probability? 2, 3. And as this number of users increases, also the likelihood that you are looking like you're at risk of bad health also increases. So this is homophily, right? And some of these things might come just from the network itself. So for example, if I just retweet somebody's content about a pizza, doesn't mean that I ate the pizza, I just retweeted it, right? So if we remove all the replies and retweets, we find the same thing. Or there could be some similar exposure to outside things. So if I live in the same city as somebody and we both go to the food festival, it doesn't mean that we're influencing each other, it's just what happens in our environment that is affecting us both. So we totally trashed our network and removed links from the same state, which is most of the links. So of course this decreased, but we still saw some of these things, some of the increase in probability. Yeah.
Did you check the temporal dynamic of this pattern? Meaning that if one person starts tweeting pizzas, then the surrounding network will, in a late point of time, will start also to tweet?
That would be the next step. Unfortunately, we just collated our whole data set together because of sparsity issues, because it's very hard to actually find this time when we know that people are connected and this person has posted a certain thing and other people post similar thing, right? So this happens very rarely. So we actually tried doing that with certain behaviors, like, well, see if they spread in a certain time period, and it's super sparse. It's hard to find it.
Yeah. It would be a great replication of the Christakis series of studies. I don't know if you know that series. So they study this, but with like. Oh, okay.
Exactly. Yes, yes. So the idea, if we can continue collecting this data, and if all of the terms of service are and allow us to do so, we indeed could try looking over a long period of time to see how the network will interact with it. So yes, we found homophily. The actual causality here is perhaps questionable. But there are other studies that show that there may be actual, causal thing there. So another thing we can look at through social media is identifying actual places where the health environment can be bad. And for example, this study looks at food deserts, and it's a place where it's hard to get food, fresh food. So there are maybe not so many food shops, groceries, or even people have difficulty getting to them. So US is notorious for having no public transport, basically. So if you're in certain places of US, you just can't get to a grocery store. So it's a combination of availability and people's ability to get to places. So the idea was to look at Instagram and see what kind of things people post in places that are food deserts versus not. Does it actually affect what people do every day? And Instagram is great because, again, it's centered on images, and it is often geolocated. So actually much more of it is geolocated than Twitter or maybe some other content-based social networks. So yeah, we get much more precise geolocation and more multimedia. So what do? They do a very similar thing as the previous study. They have a food lexicon that they send to the social media API and get back posts that they were able to geolocate. Now, from these posts, then they can connect them to tracts, basically areas in US. So you can see they're pretty large numbers, 14 million posts, 8 million users across 2 years, so it's not too bad. And the geolocation is 35%, which is not bad. So out of that, you can get good number of things. So what they do with their geolocation is actually the government itself provides a way to just send your data, and they tell you which census tract you're in. So depending on what place you're looking for, perhaps other countries or EU has similar things. So then they basically have regions where they found this data in different regions in the United States, have some posts, have some users. So these are food deserts, FD, but they also look at the non-food deserts to compare them to, and there are more of those. Now, to really compare them very well, we do matching. So who knows what matching is? People from social sciences really need to know this? Yeah, but not so many actually. Okay, so let's continue with this. So the matching is basically to make sure that you're not comparing apples to oranges, right? To say that, well, we'll try to make the comparison as fair as possible so that when we see differences is due to really the thing that we're looking at. Right. And of course, this is very dependent on what is the research question you're asking, right? So that Maybe you want to control here for how big or populated the census tract is, how many minority households you have, things like family income. So basically we want to make sure that we're comparing really whether people have access to grocery stores and not whether people have low incomes, right? Because for sure that will be an important variable. So what they do is, well, they take a tract in one of the states and compare it to all the other non-food deserts using a Mahalanobis distance. Then they basically choose the closest ones that match the best. And for the ones that they couldn't find a good match, they discard. So the idea then is that you have a good apples to apples comparison between the two treatment and control groups. So what we can do then is say, well, what is the likelihood that this something is mentioned in one area in a food desert versus non-food desert? So for example, here we have foods that are more likely to be in food deserts, less likely to be in food deserts, and just things that don't seem to go either way. So we find actually here a lot of meat, which is strange to me. Like meat should be fresh, like you want to get it from a grocery, but somehow no. The hamburgers, hot dogs, beef and sausage, mayonnaise, and bacon and barbecue are all here, and then things like quinoa and bagels are here. But it's actually interesting that to me this doesn't seem to be grocery store dependent, because quinoa, like you can just buy it anytime and like have it in your pantry, yet still it is more associated to being not in food desert. So this I think this still points to behavior outside just having a grocery store or not. Maybe how much you go out, what kind of diet you're following, etc. And then you can look at these things in different parts of the United States and Midwest and West, etc., and see what are the differences in these differences. So, for example, if you look at nutritional values like sugar, energy, fat, cholesterol, you can see that not all of them differ hugely between them. Right? Like maybe in the West, things are very different, but in others, it's not as much. So, sometimes subdividing your data set into smaller bits can be helpful. And then you can actually say, well, can we separate these areas by these nutritional values? So then you can say, well, in the Southeast, actually the difference is not that big in what people eat, but in the West it is very big, really nutritionally speaking.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Regarding the last slide. It's actually, so if you look at that table, it's a typical table of like showing some top-ranked items in some distribution, and then because it's the culture of the journal, we don't need to show the distribution.
Mm-hmm.
So how about the distributions? Like what is the meat like just, what's going on below it? Like what's the messiness?
How truly important are these things?
Yeah.
I think then performing something like the next thing is important, right? To say that really how important are they in separating the two, right? If they're just a little bit different, maybe then it doesn't matter as much. But this thing would be. Yeah, it's hard to visualize the distributions, It would be difficult to fit them into a table. Okay. So that's why we do it that way. But you're right, yeah, there's always something missing. And also to people who maybe not so familiar with doing research on lots and lots of data, they're doing here a Bonferroni adjustment of the p-values. Does anybody know why you need to do that? No? Exactly, exactly. So especially as computing people, we say, oh, we have this huge feature vector, we're going to compare everything to everything, which is not what social scientists do, I guess. They're much more theory-driven, right? But as computing people, as I'm one of those, I say, you know, compare everything to everything, and sometimes just by chance something clicks, right? And something looks significant, but then you have to have a stricter threshold for, you know, selecting these things that might be significant. And of course, then you can try, you know, classification and say, well, what if we try to classify them using, you know, the demographics and some kind of other food deprivation. I don't actually remember what those are. Features, but what if we add then some social media data and how much do we improve, and hopefully there is some improvement to this. So another thing that could be interesting to do is sometimes your model doesn't work as well as you hoped, and you say, oh my God, like all of these things that we got wrong, but error analysis can show you some things that you even want to brag about. So for example, here, they basically, there was one county in Atlanta, Georgia, that looked to the data set as if it was not a food desert, but was a food desert in the data that they were in the census, right? But what was interesting was that it was rapidly gentrifying, and it was not yet reflected in the data to which they were mapping their results, right? So it could be that your models trained on social media would be, you know, more updated than the government figures. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so all of these things, of course, come with a lot of social, a lot of images and media, but a lot of studies often look at just the text because it's easy, it's right there. As Miriam was saying, you know, like this is the easiest way to get semantics out of your data. Yet we have all of this more further information, and the question stands whether people annotate their images properly, right? Just like one of the questions earlier, can we use existing data as training for these image classifiers? Well, perhaps they weren't annotated for that purpose, right? So can we compare, you know, what people say and what they show? And the idea was, again, to look at Instagram, looking at a food query, which was super simple. It was just food, food porn, foodie, and then breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So very, very simple. And you don't really need to, sometimes like the simpler your query is the best. Yep.
Just a question of understanding. So this food lexicon is actually images, right?
No, it's just these hashtags. So the lexicon is the words that you are sending to the API, and it returns to you the posts and the images and all these things.
And then, sorry, this is for last. How would you get this coloring algorithm? So how do you match? This is pizza and this is that menu.
Well, in previous ones, it was really the annotation, right? It was these guys. And so now we're starting to talk about these guys. But this was, you know, this already behaved very nicely. Yeah. Like we already got nice correlations. So we want to enrich this with what we can extract out of here. Yeah. So yeah. Whether we're talking about textual or image data can be, yeah. So if it's unclear, ask. Yeah.
So you just said that usually people do not tag their photos that well, so they might emphasize parts that like are not important. Then what's not everything in the picture.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting that even like by analyzing the hashtag, you were getting such a correlation between the obesity, like fatness, and
yeah.
these hashtags. So I mean, it's kind of paradoxical. Even if people not like annotated good, why it works?
I know why. We don't know, right? We really don't know. And it could be that there are non-food things as well that could tip us off, you know, like where you go and, you know, like how often you go there and whether you socialize. Like there are many things that could be secondary things. But it's true, like we extracted caloric values just out of the hashtags and yet it worked already pretty well. So, yeah. So can we improve, right? Can we look at this and improve? And so the idea is that we gather a data set with the canonical food lexicon, so get a whole bunch of images back and say, okay, these are food-related posts. What we can do then is look at the top hashtags that appear here and enrich our lexicon by basically asking crowd workers. And basically we ask people, well, is this hashtag food related or not? Then we have much bigger lexicon and then go through the same thing again, like a query again and get some more posts, which results in high quality geolocated posts from these so for the final set of hashtags, they got 3.7 million images. So you can compare this to data sets that we've been talking about earlier that are standard in machine learning, which are thousands at best, right? And here we have millions easily. So again, they do geolocations and they actually use their own library instead of and so I keep on talking about geolocation because it's really important. Once you're relating internet to real life, this step is really important, even though it has nothing to do maybe with the methodologies we talk about here. This can be, because it's an important step, and I'll talk about it later, always it works not 100%, so you have to clean some of the most important parts of your data. So 10%? No, but it could take like several days. Okay. Yeah, with like good manual elbow grease to make sure that things look right. So yeah, so now we're stepping into the realm of enormous, beautiful things. And so what they're doing is to label their images, they use some previous work where they're using a deep residual network that they claim can train substantially deeper models. Okay, so I am not an expert here, and I will refer to your questions about exactly what's going on here to others who know more about it. But the idea is that they take this, you know, these many, many layers, and they basically train it on what? Sorry. So for this paper, they basically trained it on the ImageNet and got good results. And in fact, this paper got first prize in a labeling task. So if you want to get the latest code, you know, you just find one of these competitions where people have to create, you know, compete on a standard data set, and they often can share their code. So you take this pre-trained model, and what they do is instead of taking the 1,000 way softmax that it had, and replace it with 100 softmax that is then trained on 100 standard tags that are interesting to us for this research. Now, where did these tags come from? Well, again, there's some previous efforts that have put together 101 food categories and images that go along with them, so really meticulous, nice work. And in this paper, they basically took Instagram images and kind of matched them to these categories. So now we have kind of a high high quality food 101 and much lower quality, just throwing words into abyss Instagram data set. And they trained this model on them, and basically when you train on this food data set and test on this food data set, it's okay, 80% is not bad. I think it's accuracy. Did put it. But then if you test it on Instagram data set, it's not so good, right? Because perhaps how people photograph things in the real life, maybe the way that they use cell phones, the way they produce images is different, and the training no longer applies as well. But then if you train it on Instagram, you actually don't get as good of a performance on the food one, but you actually still get a much more decent one on the Instagram. And the cool part is that there's much more data that comes from social media. So you can throw it more and more and more images, and the performance might even overstep the nice data set. So then we could say, okay, there is perhaps a perception gap in the way that a computer might see your picture and what you actually annotated with, right? And then they made this some sort of scoring. So if you mentioned it and the computer didn't mention, and if you mentioned something and the computer did not see it, there's also a score. And then you can see, this is not very readable, basically what kinds of foods are related to some kinds of health outcomes. For example, food insecurity. The machine will actually find Insta beer in your posts. So maybe you don't want to admit that you're drinking, but the machine sees that you're drinking. And we see it actually later with alcohol. There's the negative relationship with sushi. Maybe you'd like to claim you're having sushi, but the machine's not seeing it. And other things like that. Chicago pizza, of course, is negatively associated with alcohol-related deaths. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's going on. So the idea is that then you can also look at subjective labels and see, well, when you say something is delicious, what does the computer tell us? So to see, so given some subjective tag, what will the machine tag? What is the probability of this machine tag? And again, for example, if you say it's organic, then it's probably the association there is with excess drinking. You're probably having Korean food. So actually, I myself don't know exactly how to interpret this because it's really between the perception of the machine and the perception of humans. How to exactly go forward with that is a complicated question, I think. So some of the observations so far, social media data can be a cheap way to train your models, just by the power of it being plentiful, right? Maybe it's very noisy, but perhaps if you just keep throwing it in some scenarios, maybe it's okay. And that it provides an alternative view to what people actually write. So, okay, so we found this. Now, can we somehow relate it to people's health? And so again, looking at Instagram, the very similar setup in this paper. And one of these, so what we're using is one of these services that you can use for annotating your data. Here, for example, it tells us that there are tags that are dish and sandwich and hamburger and other things. They can be pretty good, and we'll see that they're not super great, but you can get some good tags there. And in this work, they basically take tags at a certain confidence that it provides, and annotate their data with these tags, and then basically I think the machine-generated tags is the I. So if you look at this column, actually it does very well in detecting excessive drinking. Even better than if you're looking at demographics, which is usually, demographics is always like one of the best things that predict anything. But actually, the machine can better predict when people are drinking. And of course, if you combine them, it's even better. So the idea is that, of course, you cannot trust the machine all the time. In fact, we can see that they don't always label the data in the best way. But if you integrate it in some known, and especially for some particular tasks, it could be valuable. I don't know, impressive plots, whatever. Or you can even say, well, what is the most distinguishing feature? Example here for excessive drinking. We can say, well, that people are smiling and they're having meetings. There are glasses and liquids and beverages involved. Okay, so we can say that there is some something that we can interpret pretty straightforwardly. Maybe not as straightforwardly some other things like modeling physical inactivity. We can say, well, we don't see bellies as much, or don't see leaves. We don't see people feeling good. But yet we see, I don't know, so, or some income variable. So for some others, it may be more easy, more difficult to interpret. And in that sense, I would encourage everybody to not take all these big lexicons or big data sets and throw them into your, notebooks and just run with them. But if you're interested in a particular task, focus on that, because you might come up with things you might not know how to interpret. Another thing I want to mention that is not quite a lifestyle thing, but people have been trying to use images on social media and relating them to basically depression. Now, this is an interesting case study because now we are not using geolocation to understand whether people may be healthy or not, or what other demographics we can get out of it. We're actually asking people on a crowdsourced platform. They did a depression inventory and asked them informed consent for using their social media for research. So all of the studies before this, GDPR may be a problem, right? They probably were made before GDPR anyway. But in this case, this is much more expensive, right? You don't get as much data, at least you don't get as many people, for sure. But you do get high quality annotation of individuals, and you get informed consent, which is good. Let us agree on that. So here they got 560 people that had 20 or more images in their Twitter. And I don't remember what they were doing with a Facebook data set. They also got involved there. So here, these are some blurred images from more depressed and less depressed people. So which is the top one, more or less depressed? Less. Anybody more? Okay, a couple more. Okay. Less depressed people. And it's not super obvious, right? It's somehow maybe more bright, maybe, but yeah, it's not necessarily obvious to me anyway.
It's more labeled, right?
Hmm?
It's more clearly labeled, isn't it?
Well, they're both blurred in the same way.
So if you have to come up with a word, it's easier to come up with words for the images above than for
Oh, they have more like identifiable objects. Yeah, could be. So if you want to do some kind of very generic description of images, this is a good paper to follow because they're using all kinds of stuff. So the HSV values that Miriam has already been speaking about, the hue, all kinds of histograms of colors, whether they're warm or cold. there's a cool thing that actually produce aesthetics. So like whether there's symmetry or motion blur, vividity of color. This is cool. I would want to apply this to everything I produce. Then, of course, there's imaga that we saw before. Tags that are clustered, actually. So it's clusters of tags instead of just the tags themselves. So there are existing CNNs that have been trained for some objects, Face++ that we already saw discussed, etc. So a whole lot. So if you don't know what to compute for your images, just take this list and run with it. And then you can take this and say, okay, so what is correlating with mental health? So here they also look at demographics with gender and age. But these two are the mental health one, and it's interesting to see. So, for example, the grayscale is much more prevalent for depressed people, anxious people too. Let's see, what are some of the big ones? Not vivid color, not symmetric, overall aesthetic score is negative. So you can see that there are relationships, and their strength can vary. So this can be interesting, although I'm not sure how useful it would be in actually classifying people into, I'm not sure it's strong enough signal, but it's interesting anyway. And then you can look at what people actually, how the images look like, right? All kinds of, whether there are people, whether there are facial expressions. Depressed people don't smile. But you wouldn't know this necessarily, because the anxious people are slightly more inclined to smile in their pictures. Oh, interesting. And then you can even see like what kind of imaga things were associated with one or another, but I don't think we really have time to read through this whole thing. And of course, then you want to throw it into a machine learning algorithm and try to classify these people solely from their images. And you can see, so they're trying different tasks. This is Pearson correlation. And you can see that it's not high. Right? So compared to predicting, for example, drinking, the internal mental states can be much more difficult. But there have been attempts. So the idea is that much more easy to model populations than individuals, of course. And of course, much more easy to model something that is visible than something that is internal. I'm not sure what I'm saying here, and that getting ground truth can be difficult, especially for the said mental states, right? Some things people will not want to admit to. So, for example, there are many studies on things like I don't know, people going to the gym, or people admitting that they have diabetes. So it's not really a taboo to have diabetes, But if you have HIV, maybe not everyone's going to go on social media and talk about it. And, getting ground truth for these populations can be more or less difficult depending. So that's why looking at lifestyle diseases is a bit more easy, because it has to do with where you go and what you eat and socially acceptable things that are visible, that people are okay with sharing. So one of the questions that often arises is, well, maybe the machines are stupid, right? Like they obviously don't see what we see in the pictures. And so could you actually say, well, what is the BMI, the body mass index of a person from a picture? And there are interesting places to get data for this. For example, this is Reddit Lose It community, where people actually annotate really rigorously their posts. So you can find from this thing that it's a male of 30 years, 6 feet 5 inches, with starting weight this, current weight that, and goal weight this, right? And they've lost this much. And it's like, you would have to pay a lot of money to people to produce this sort of annotation. And then they have progress pics of before and after, or current, which are very nice. Now, have they consented to us using it for this purpose? I'm not so sure. I haven't read the Reddit terms of service, but yet the paper is out here, so judge for yourselves. And basically what they're doing is looking at just the faces, right, not the bodies. And it's easy to compute BMI because you just take it as kilos and weight, and it's just a proportion. But in fact, there is another data set that is very well annotated, and that's in some states in the US, when you get arrested, they take a picture of you in the police, right? And you have to also fill out some basic information about yourself. And they put this information online. Okay, so it's a highly, you know, and it's nice because the picture is very standardized, you know, people standing forward, no expression or bad expression. And I've seen it used even in research. Now, somebody tell me something wrong with this picture here. It's very biased, okay, to people who might get arrested. Also,
It's not as standard as they think because the camera usually positions it.
technical difficulties with the camera, but above all, huh?
Take a picture of you, but you are innocent.
I mean, even if you're guilty, you know, but nobody asks you, right? Consent, consent, everyone. Yeah, so the idea is that it's a high quality data set that you probably should not use for moral reasons. These people are in vulnerable situation, you know, they got busted by the cops, and that's when you take their data for research. It's just not nice. So don't do that. And even this is, at least these people have tried to posted their pictures online themselves, at least that.
How much can you trust this? Because the person I did before was not real.
No, I was just taking it from another thing. Yeah, the description was not from the picture. Sorry for the confusion. But you're right, it is self-annotated. So, but hopefully these people are so obsessed with keeping track of the thing that they wouldn't want to, yeah. But we don't know that. You're right. So yeah, this was a pretty easy setup. You have a bunch of faces and of known BMI, and basically they also did some known setups for their deep learning features, and basically what they did is they trained it on the BMI data set. We used some held out set for evaluation, and there was, you know, they're okay, you know, it's not performing as well as I would have hoped, but it is just faces. Now, would people do any better? So they decided not to even ask people about the BMI because not everybody understands what BMI is, you know, and like, unless you're really into the whole weight loss thing, you might not even know what your BMI is, right? So what they do is just ask, well, given these two pictures, which one is heavier? That's it, right? And they also stratified it by gender so that you're not only asking certain kinds of comparisons. Went to Amazon Mechanical Turk. Everybody should try it, just for fun. It's a lot of fun to run these tasks. And then compared it to machine performance, and it was very much the same. So people couldn't estimate it any better than the machine. So this is intriguing, right? Because did we hit the limit, the absolute limit of the task? Or is it possible to train machine even better? You know, what if we give it more layers? What if we have even better cameras? You know, what if it's 3D shot or something? What if we have like an X-ray as well? Would machines then perform better than people? So far not, but we don't know. And they were actually having a good question about bias here. So there are existing relationships between certain demographics and having certain health conditions. And here, for example, does the machine actually learns that African Americans tend to have a higher BMI? Well, they gave it a balanced set of male to female pictures, and actually for the gender thing, it chose higher for females, and for white versus African American, it chose actually higher BMIs for white. So, and of course they were controlled to be the same actually. So there is a bias, but we don't understand it. It's not necessarily the way that we think. But they were saying, well, it's a small data set and maybe biased, so. But these are important checks to do if you have you know, a diverse set of people in your data set. You know, if there are known biases you want to look out for, check for them. Okay, so bonus paper. And this has nothing to do with health, but I thought it was just so neat. So basically, they were looking at the way to combine information about images and recipes, which consist of ingredients and cooking instructions. So basically, they crawled a whole lot of recipe websites that have images of completed dishes, and now there is a data set that you can download. So basically, they used some LSTMs for modeling the ingredients and the cooking instructions. And the way I understand is that they needed two-stage because cooking instructions are sets of, so the instruction itself may be a set of things to do, and then there's sets of steps. So they were, you know, really clever in modeling this. Then this is all connected to the image, which is, we already know that it has some kind of convolution happening. So it gets smaller and smaller, and then we have some high-level representation of that. And all of this is then connected through some semantic regularization, where, you know, some high-level concepts from one side are connected to high-level concepts on the other, and it is married. Don't tell me, or don't ask me explain any of this. A high level, this is the idea. So if you are ever trying to connect I don't know, some complicated notion with a picture, it is possible, right? Here's an example. But one of the cool things that I do understand is what you can do with such things, right? You can say, okay, I have a representation that is an image, and I know what ingredients are in it. Well, what kind of ingredients does this map to on the other side? And given these ingredients, what kind of image do I get back? Right? It's like a broken telephone. Like if you screen one thing into one side, what comes out in the other? And it actually, based on these, it looks okay, right? Like some things get lost, but actually what comes out is maybe not so bad. So this is a retrieval task. Another thing that is just delightful that they were able to do is concept math. Right. So you say basically, let me tell it. So they used an averages of vectors of recipes. So recipe is a collection of things. They average all these things into the vector, and then they have they do math in this learned space. So you take chicken lasagna, subtract lasagna, add salad, you get. All right, et cetera, right? So you take cheese salad. Minus salad plus cake, should get a cheesecake. So So this is pretty cool, right? So it's perhaps, of course, the domain is extremely limited, right? It's recipes, etc. But if this is what you are trying to, build the tool for, this could be really cool. Especially one of the uses that people are, trying to use this for is food diets or food allergies. Like I would like to eat something like this, but I cannot eat cheese. Like let's subtract cheese. Let's see what alternatives are. And I don't know. I thought it was really neat. It has little to do with health, but yeah, it's fun. Yeah, and actually, so the previous thing was querying using images, but then you can also query using recipes. So you can go from both sides. Yeah, so I thought that was fun. So this was an interesting setting in which they were able to get a really high quality data set, right? And people were really annotating them very carefully, make sure to don't boil it too much and so like these people were really into curating their own data carefully, and if you know where to look, you could get high quality data. But there is a problem that not all ingredients are visible, right? If something is high fat, so if you want to look into this data just using images, and you have a porridge, right? And you send it in, whether I melted butter into that porridge, nobody knows, right? Or how much I salted it, or many other invisible things, or how long did I fry my chicken? Maybe from the hue you can tell, but you never know. So there are things that maybe you can associate, that if I look at Coke, there's probably sugar, but with all of these newfangled, alternative foods, you might not, this might not work. So there are still interesting things to be done here. Yep.
With the concept map, that's the same thing as done with like word vectors.
Exactly. Yeah. It's very similar.
Does it work as well with images? Do you know? Just because images are more, I guess I would assume that like it's harder with images because you might not have like, what was the example? Like chicken lasagna might be in the background or something. So you need like really clear examples where you have, it's like the whole focus is dominated by this chicken lasagna. And
exactly. Well, here again, it's nice that the use case is very clear, right? The images were produced for people who are looking at foods. It's not like I'm really taking a selfie and there's a lasagna in the background, right? So in that sense, you don't want those sort of things. So you're right, it's very context dependent, that if only in this context it will work in general.
That like the concept mapping works as well.
I'll tell you, there is no general, right? Because you are able to do this just because you have highly precisely annotated data set. Like if you try to do this for other very general things, maybe your data set's not going to be good, maybe your annotations fuzzy, maybe it's not going to match, or like the pictures were taken in different ways. So there can be many things wrong, just even with the input.
There's a question, does it work that good with birds? As you assume.
Yeah, does it?
That's what I use for a lot of my research. That's why I'm curious, because
it
works really well with many cases of words. Not all, like types of dimensions. Like gender, it works great. That's always the published example. But others, it starts breaking down.
But with gender, you have the top 10,000 words that define gender, so they're super frequent, right? But if you have queen and, right, and is it and the actonetric theory of Bruno Latour is an actual insect? What we're talking about. There's an article where Queen Victoria I had the first flushing toilet, which is analyzed with and the actonetric theory of Bruno Latour. If that article would give you a data set, you couldn't say queen minus insect, and then you get the British queen. It doesn't work, right? So the key thing is like we work in really neat domains, and just saying, okay, it works well in my neat domains, like gender, and I have a defined grammar in the English language. it works really well there, so it works well with words, and does it work well with images as well? I think we cannot make that decision between words and images, because if you have well-defined data sets with images, it works very well. If you have well-defined word data sets, it works very well. And so the computer linguistics crowd is very good in well-defining their data sets, while the image crowd right now, which is raw images from the internet, which by definition are messy.
Yeah.
So if you would have our act together, like the computational linguistics crowd, it would probably work as well.
But then not all images, again, from internet are that messy, right? These
Sure,
people
sure,
really
sure,
want
exactly.
to position their dish and take a good photo. So just like in any other data-based research, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So if you have a nice data set, you probably will have some good stuff coming out. But again, you know, what you're looking for. If I'm looking at salt content, ain't nothing is going to help me with that, right? So you got to match your questions to what you can actually, you know, actually see in the data, right? You know, for sure.
Okay, so I have a question about the LSTM slide. So you mean you could associate those complex concepts with the pictures, with the images? Could you explain it more? How to do this?
Read the paper. Please read the paper. I have no idea.
Which paper? Could you
Well, I flashed it here, but I will put it on SlideShare, and it will be also posted on the website of the school, I think. Yeah, because I didn't write it, and it seems way too complicated for me. But they do a good job in the paper describing what it is. Because, yeah, it's not straightforward. Like, it's not just the tags. They do like word2vec for the tags and represent that instead of like the individual ones. I apologize, but yeah, you have to read the paper. Yeah, so any more like questions that are not about LSTMs? All right, so I hope you got kind of an idea of a possible setup of a study in this way, right? You get some data, you process it, you get some real world data, and then you map them together and you get some kind of interesting output, right? So just to run through a possible setup of such a study, I want to show you, at least how I get some social media data, geolocate it, link it to some statistics, use some services to label things, then link it back to maybe some information, and do something clever with it. So who here actually created their own social media data sets? Like actually called APIs and all these things? Okay, good, like 10%, very nice, maybe even 20. So for those that haven't done this, it is very careful work, right? Because if you're lucky, they have nice APIs, right? And they can give you clean data sets. If you're unlucky, you have to crawl it yourself and parse HTML and ungodly mess, but there are libraries to do that as well. So for example, what I do is I think, it would be great to study dieting, right? So I find some keywords for that, and I have some API client that queries this. Now then I have a watcher that is looking at my API client and make sure that it's running, because your servers die, the internet goes down, the network shuts down. You have to make sure things are running and when you're not looking, which often is nice to log that as well. And then this all triggers that, so that can be nice. So this is a streaming scenario, and those who are not familiar with the idea of a stream is very relevant in social media because things are generated all the time. So unlike in social sciences where perhaps you get all of your data all at once by surveying your subjects, in internet, it's really a stream of data that is always coming to you. So often you capture the stream instead of going in the past and getting your data from there. So, yeah?
about the job watcher. So
Uh-huh.
how do you write a robot or something else?
I will show you my job watcher. Of all the things that I haven't the wave my hands at, that one I will show you. And so one of the difficulties though here is that you have to know what you're looking for right away, right? You can't say, oh, I forgot that this thing was relevant. You can't go back in the stream and get it. Right? You capture it now or never. That can be a difficulty, and yeah, you have to like write. And usually, like I have all of this because I've done it like over the years, and things have gone wrong, and I've lost data, and you know, then I had to write code on top of code to keep it going. Oh my God, it is impossible to see. Okay, then I'll just show what's going on, just kind of by showing like bits of text. So for example, for Twitter, you need some API keys, and Miriam already mentioned this. This is really gold, right? If you have good API keys, and sometimes they discontinue keys, and you have some from the pre-discontinuing era, and you're like, oh, you share it with your best friends, you know. This can be really important, so keep them alive as much as you can. So basically here I say my keywords are diet, dieting, etc., whatever. Sometimes it's much longer than that. And then I just sign in with my authenticator. You know, I send this information. I say, okay, give me the stream. And I just dump it outside. So yeah, when you get the data, you just, you know, my code anyway is pretty stupid. It writes it to standard output. And this is so simple because you want to debug things and you want to try running it, this and that. You might want to run it from different places. But this would be a stream query maybe for many applications, not just Twitter. This is just an example. Now, the job watcher is much more complicated, actually. So the first bit of text, in fact, this is written in Perl. I apologize to everyone. But it's just the neat language for these sort of things. So we ask, well, is the job running? Where is the file being saved? What is today's date? And then we say, okay, what can we do? If it's not running, we restart the job. If it's running, but it's the next day, we restart the job, make sure our files are all handled nicely. And we can even process yesterday's data, right? So every day, this is triggered every minute. So if the server went down, then it restarted. Right away, on the very next minute, it's triggered, and it checks that things are going fine. So this is for if you're getting any sort of data, and you want to make sure that things are okay. So one of the biggest things is that, especially if you're just learning to code now, forget about writing a lot of code. Your code should fit into your screen, right? Or two screens. Because if you're doing any more than that, things will go wrong, and you won't know why, right? And then you will have to get it smaller to debug. So, you know, I got a computer science degree, and yet I write this, you know? So you're not an engineer, you're a scientist, and you will have to be very careful with every step. And then, yeah, I have the cron tab thing here, which is basically a Linux thingy that runs a command every so often. So, for example, here I say, run it all the time, well, all the minutes. So this is the way I do it. I'm not sure, you know, there are probably like fancy servers from maybe your institutions that can do these things, but I don't trust any server that I don't operate myself. Because if this goes down and I'm losing data, it's going to be a disaster. So this produces then files, one for each day. And for example, here, I already process it a little bit, and I zip up the original thing. And what's good here is that you can see if something goes wrong in the sizes of data. So if you are using a lot of data, don't put it all in one file, if you can, right? If you can segment it by something, do it, because if something goes wrong, even if you're having it for different cities, for different this, for different topics, it's good to just, you know, if something goes wrong and you corrupt the file, it's not going to be your whole PhD running out the window. So for example, then I might want to parse it. So it's maybe not so interesting to look at my fancy for loop, but the thing is, when you're working with real world data, when you're downloading things, when you're getting character encodings and stuff, things will go wrong no matter what, right? So I would suggest write your code without try catch, try except, see what kind of errors you might get. But then once you're actually deploying it, yeah, there always has to be try catch around your code because something will go wrong, right? And just send it to an error, to a log somewhere, you know, to see what's going on if something does go wrong. But so for example, here I'm watching out for different character encoding because things are coming out from all over the world. Tabs, because my stuff is tab separated. Often there are new lines, you know, like there are page like breaks and all of these like Windows, Linux things that don't work together, and of course random stuff. So yeah, I will, again, this will be in the slides, so you don't have to like squint at it right now. But yeah, this is actual data that will come out. So at this point, you should not be afraid to look at it, right? Embrace it, stare at it right in the face. You know, and I would say, of course, we've been seeing right now all of these notebooks, right? But before you run your notebook, if you really don't know anything about the data set, you know, look at it in the most raw way that you can, because you will see special characters, you know, whatever the heck that is, you know, how things are separated. You know, if something was to go wrong with it, if you can visually determine it just from like looking at it, is the best way. You know, if you see it through some fancy library that's loading it into an object, you might not be able to understand what is going on, right? So this is important. Yeah, and then, you know, you could get it without streaming, of course, and you just gonna have to negotiate with rate limits and things, and might not get as much as you would think. And of course, everything is live, so maybe things existed at some point, but if you come back and look for them, they may be gone. So that's another thing of, you know, if you are trying to collect live, you know, what people are actually sharing every day, you know, better collect it sooner rather than later. And I think I already talked about geolocation. It's really important. You can give it some text. It will give you like IDs and confidence and maybe GPS locations, which are great. You might want to check like quality of things. Yeah, this is not interesting. Then you can find health statistics or statistics about your population. This can be really nice, especially if you're working with a lot of people. So there are things for US that gives you like statistics per county, which is very nice and small. Statistics for example, Italy, where I live now. There's Istat that gives you, for example, immigration statistics. There are surveys that are done by even bigger organizations that you could maybe use for your research. And of course, you can use crowdsourcing to actually ask people what their health is. But then you have to be real careful about what you're asking them. And I think we've talked about image processing already fine. I just want to say that it guesses my age like perfectly, I think, which is, I think I was 28 and it aged 25, which is nice. But then, yeah, it's really interesting. So I would, I think Face++ has a demo. Go and put your picture in it. It's super interesting. But you're right, there's ethnicity and other things that may be questionable that you want to be careful with. And then, of course, for my case, for example, I use some nutritional stuff. For your case, whatever you're studying, maybe there are other data sets that are provided by big like governments or by specific websites, and you put them all together and you get it. And then you can do fun stuff, you know. If you can visualize it and put it online, and you get many more citations. So for example, here we were mapping out the food porn of different countries, and people really like that. So yeah, thank you.